Okay, so let's talk about why I think this is the only ski binding that you'll ever need. You're gonna have to move, I'm afraid. The people want to see the skis and the bindings, not the kitty cat. So hello friends and welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, my name's Dave Searle and I'm an IFMGA guide based out in Chamonix, France. And make sure you head down there and hit that subscribe button, and that way you're not going to miss any of my future videos. Before we get stuck into this video though, I should give you a little caveat. Now, I am sponsored by ATK. Yes, they give me free bindings. I asked them if I could join the team and they were very happy to welcome me on board. Now, they don't pay me, they're not paying me to say any of this stuff. I'm not getting paid to make this video. Well, why would you make a video if you're not getting paid for it? What's the point? Well, this is just something that I'm really passionate about. I love making sure that people get into the right equipment and they understand how it works and the pros and cons of different things and why I like to use certain things. So that's really the impetus for me making this video. Nothing more, so hopefully you can believe me that this is all coming from a good place. So this video is basically a review or an overview of this binding, which is the ATK FREERAIDER 15 EVO. Later on in the video, we're going to get into some of the real details of these bindings, and then I'm also going to talk about some of the setup options that you have with this specific binding. Now for me, I'm based out in Chamonix. I tend to do a mixture of a little bit of piste skiing, maybe to get between lifts so I can kind of get out into the backcountry or do the sort of side country stuff that's around. But mostly I'm focused on ski touring and getting out into the mountains, skiing steeper lines, a little bit of free riding, that type of stuff. Although I do have a fairly big quiver of skis and some of the bindings that I own are pure downhill bindings, the only reason that I have those is so I can ski a beefy downhill boot that doesn't have tech inserts at the front and the back. But most days I'm not really skiing those boots. They're kind of too uncomfortable to be wearing all day, and I don't really need that level of performance most days. So for me, I'm ending up in a boot like this, which is a Technica 0G Tour Pro. Now, I've done a video about the boots that I'm skiing, so you can check that out here. But the important thing to note about these boots is these are really designed to get out into the mountains, so you can be scrambling around on rocks, using crampons, climbing short sections of ice, but also having a really good experience on the way down. I see this as my everyday ski boot, pretty much. You could think of this as I don't know, in car terms, like an SUV, and my downhill boots would be like a race car. Before we talk about all the small features on this binding, I want to talk about some of the functions of it to start with, because these are the things that people are going to be interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And it's really important to understand that the function of these bindings is the best that I've ever seen. Let's talk about why that is. Now, one of the most important features for people when they're thinking about a low-tech pin binding like this is how easy it is to step in at the toe. A lot of people really struggle with that when they're coming from a downhill binding or a frame binding to coming onto a tech binding like this, is that it can be really difficult to line up the pinholes and to step in. Now, ATK have really got you covered with this. This is one of the easiest bindings to step in that I've ever found. Let me show you just how easy it is. So here, when you take the boot and you slide it forward like this, you literally slide it until it stops at the front. You don't have to come back a little bit or line it up with the holes as you're looking down at it. You literally put your foot in, slide it forward until it stops, and then you're just going to press down at the front and it's going to go in like that. Easy peasy. What can happen if your boot starts to get a little bit worn is it can actually become more difficult to step in, and actually these bindings don't suffer from that. If you've worn out the toe rubber on your boot, it's still really easy to fit in, because basically the way that it's working is your boot is stopping against the pins rather than stopping against something at the bottom of the binding. So it still works really well if you've got worn boots. If you've done a lot of ski touring, you might find that those pin inserts have been a little bit worn away over time. And what can happen when you're on the skin track is that your boot might come out a little bit. ATK have a way that you can adjust the tension of the lockout for the toe, so it can accommodate for different widths that you have if you have a very, very small difference in the pin depth on your ski boots, for example. Let me show you how easy it is to get the boot down into the ski. This binding is set up with a release value of 13, and look how easy it is for me to clip this binding in like this. That was pretty easy, right? Now, the way that ATK have designed the pins to move when you step down into them, it means they move down and out of the way as you step in. So it's super easy to clip into these bindings, but you can set a really high release value, and it's definitely a lot harder than it was to get into these skis. With a binding like this, which is the Couloir 12 Super Light, it has a U pin at the back. Now this U pin basically is quite difficult to stamp down into. Basically, I find that actually stamping down into a U pin designed binding pretty uncomfortable. It's especially when you're on a steep slope, trying to stamp and get your heel down into it can be quite difficult, but it feels kind of more reassuring for people to stamp down into these U-pins because they can feel what it's like both down and then kind of what it will be like on the way out as well. So it does feel very different when you step into the Freeraider 15 EVO. It feels very easy to step in and people are like, whew, that feels quite easy to step in. Oh, I feel like it's going to come off my foot, but it doesn't. It's much, much stronger on the way out than on the way in. When we want to step out of these bindings, it's quite easy to do that. They have a nice small plastic dish here, which you can easily put the tip of your ski pole into, press down, and you're easily out of the ski binding like that. The next really important function or way that this binding works that's really interesting for a lot of people is that you can leave the brake down like this, and when you're ready to ski tour uphill, so you have your skins on, you have your boots set up into ski touring mode, you can turn the turret of the back of the binding like so and leave it like this. You can step into the front of the binding, and then on that first step down like this, you press down and it engages the brake and lifts it up and out of the way. Now, if you want to ski down, all you need to do is just twist that heel piece around again, and this is going to disengage the brake. Twist like so, and you're ready to step back in. So you can even do that while staying clipped in at the toe. The heel raisers have little magnets and they're super easy to move around, so you can very easily do it with your basket on your ski pole. One little tip for twisting the turret around is I like to put one of the spacers on one side and leave the other back, and that way I've got a little bit more of a handle to pull against to twist this binding around. So just like that, and then we can flop this one back over that way and it's out of the way. So talking a little bit more about the design of the bindings, and something that I think really sets these apart is the snow-free design at the toe. Now, what does that mean? Now, this binding is the ATK Couloir Super Light, and it has a bit of a gap underneath here, basically. And there is a way that you can get snow underneath there, and in certain conditions, that snow can then melt and then freeze again, and you end up with ice sitting underneath this part of the binding, which can be quite difficult to get out. You have to maybe even use a knife or a small kind of implement to get underneath there and clean that ice out. And if that ice builds up badly, let's say when you're boot packing up a couloir, you somehow get some snow in there and then the sun hits it and then you go into the shade again, it could mean that these pins don't properly engage into the boot and you're not getting the full release value. So if you have a binding like this that has a gap underneath it, this is definitely something to keep an eye on when you're out in the field. A lot of the bindings that ATK make have a snow-free design on the toe, and this is no exception. There basically is no way that you can get snow underneath the wings of this binding, which means that you're not going to get that issue of it getting iced up underneath and the pins not fully engaging into the boot. What I would say for the release value is that generally I'm about one value higher than it would be on, let's say, a look pivot, for example, but I would start at your normal release value for your downhill bindings, and if the ski is coming off, then you could always turn it up a notch or possibly two. A little side note here about release values and pin bindings, and what a lot of people don't know or understand is that on the pins themselves there's a small little notch, and this is designed to clear any of the ice out of the toe inserts on the boot, and it serves a really important function that clearing that ice out means that the pins can go all the way in. So that's going to mean that you have the exact release value that you're supposed to have. So it's important that when you step into a binding and you clip in, that you cycle the binding through at least once like this, and that should clear any of that residual ice out of the toe of the binding and mean that the pins are all the way into those inserts. So just make sure that you do that, and if you don't do that, make sure you start doing that now. The only times that I don't do that are when it's particularly dry or it's particularly cold and I know that there isn't going to be any ice buildup in there, or if I'm in a real rush to catch a lift, for example. But I've certainly had it before with ice buildup in the toe that I've clipped in and it's not been fully in, and I've made one turn or two turns and the ski's just come off because it's not been set at that value. And I've stepped back in, I haven't changed any of the settings, and cycled through a couple of times, and then I've clipped in and it's been totally fine. So it definitely is a thing, and I know that people like Vivian Boucher, for example, he'll actually spend some time when he's at the top of a steep line picking ice out of the toes of his bindings with a knife. So that's really interesting to think about when you're moving towards these low-tech bindings. So the Freeraider 15 EVO comes with the Freeride spacer. Now, what does the Freeride spacer here actually do? Well, it means that the heel of your boot can be sat directly onto the ski. So when you're putting high level of pressure through the ski boot, is that you're not just relying on the pins that are sat in the back of the boot, which could be twisting ever so slightly as the ski is under torsion. So here we've got a really good feel through the heel of the ski, and you're pressing down directly on the ski with the rubber of the ski boot, which for me just feels a little bit better. It just adds a more damp feel to the binding as well and the whole ski experience, and I just really like to have this Freeride spacer in. Now on the Raider 11 EVO and the Raider 13 EVO, they don't come with this Freeride spacer as standard, but you can very easily add it in if it's something that you want. One thing I really hate with a lot of tech bindings is they can feel quite rattly, but actually this binding, there's very little rattle to it. When you're clipped in, basically the toe lever is totally solid. When you're all the way up and there's a boot in there, the lever is also totally solid. There's just not really much that's flapping around. This is on like a magnetic system. What you can find is when it's twisted around like this can be a little bit rattly, but actually if you push down onto those pins like that, then this is actually a lot more solid. So when you're doing your kick turns, it's not being like flopped over by accident. So just make sure you push that down a little bit and it's held between those two pins. So let's talk a little bit about the setup of these bindings, and any good ski tech who's selling these bindings should know everything there is to know about setting these bindings up. They're a little bit more complicated than some bindings. They come with a 4mm toe raise like this and a separate set of screws that can accommodate for this. So if the binding is without this on the ski, you have shorter screws, and then when you have this piece in here, you have a longer set of screws. So depending on how you initially set these bindings up, you'll have a spare set of screws. So make sure that when you go and buy these bindings from a shop somewhere, that you go in there and that you make sure that you ask for the spacer and the longer screws, or if you're going to put the spacer on, then make sure you ask for the shorter screws back as well. So they should give you all the spare parts for it back, but just make sure that you ask for those as well. Now, should you be using this 4mm spacer underneath the toe of the binding? That's a really good question. For me, once I'd finished setting up my boot, and there was various things that I did to get myself in the best ski position. Now, what I don't like to have is a spoiler inside the back of my boot whilst I'm touring, because I find that it can get kind of stuck on the walk mechanism as I'm moving around. I used the Raide Research adjustment on this boot to give myself a little bit more forward lean than it came stock, and then I also have a 4mm raise underneath my heel, and that not only lifts up my heel and pushes me against the top of the boot, but it also opens up the joint of my foot and it puts me in a slightly more comfortable position. And then on the front of the ski boot, I also have a pad basically, which takes out some of that space around the front of the boot. So basically I've done quite a lot of work to this boot to get me in a comfortable ski position. Now I would describe myself as a reasonably aggressive front of ski boot, you know, aggressive skier. I'm not basically middle of the ski boot or back seat that much. Well, I mean, yeah, obviously sometimes. But I like to be in the front of my ski boot and I like to be driving around the turns. And for me, I felt actually without this plate, I was a little bit too far forward. Now I could have made some other adjustments back to the boot, but actually by putting this on the ski and setting it up with this plate underneath the toe, the binding is a little bit more flat. So the height between the toe pins and the back pins is a little bit flatter. So actually I start with this, and then if I feel like I want a little bit more lean, or if I feel like I'm not able to get over the tip of the skis enough, for example, to get them engaged, then I might take this one out and then drop it down 4mm at the front, and then I can be in a little bit more of an aggressive position. But all of my skis have the same 4mm plate at the moment, and I just keep it consistent with all the skis, and that means that if I'm stepping into this, which is kind of more of a powder touring ski, or if I'm stepping into my 106, which is my more like everyday, I don't know what's happening with the condition ski, then it's all going to feel the same basically. We've spoken about the release value. I would talk to your ski tech about that as well, and just make sure that you're kind of aligned on what you're going to be starting out on. And yeah, be prepared that you might want to kind of lift that value up a little bit more than, let's say, if you're on a Look binding or a Solomon STH binding. So the next really important thing to think about with the setup is getting the boot gap between the back of the boot and the front of the heel turret of the binding set up properly. Now on all the new ATK FREERAIDER 15 EVOs, they have a line scribed onto the pins, and you can perfectly line up the back of the boot with that line. So it's really, really easy to set up. You don't need to be putting a shim down the back. Now, what might happen is that line wears out over time and you can't see it very well. So it is worth having a few different plastic shims so you can check that the gap is correct if you're changing boots. Now, one of the really nice features about this binding is it does have heel elasticity. Now, what does heel elasticity actually mean, and what does it translate into? It means that once we flex the ski to its extremes, the binding has the option to be able to move back a little bit and then come back to its original position. And that's basically done by a spring in the bottom of the plate which is mounted onto the ski. Now previously ATK were using a plastic mounting plate like this, and it's got a slightly bigger spring in it, and you could see the spring in the back of it if you were to wind the binding all the way forward. Now what they've actually changed to is a CNC'd aluminium 7075 piece like this, and you can actually upgrade the heel piece on your old bindings with this new aluminium one if you would like to. It's only a tiny bit heavier. I'm going to put the difference between these two up on the screen now. I think this is a really nice upgrade. Aluminium like this is going to be a much better material to be screwed down on top of the ski, and they've thought about the ski flex. They've made a small area that the ski can flex around the back of it as well, and you've still got the heel elasticity that we had before. Now with this old plastic plate, you would set a 4mm gap between the back of the boot and the front of the binding. With these new aluminium power plates, you can drop that down to a 3mm gap. And that means that you can be using that heel elasticity sooner, which gives you a more damp feel as well. So I actually set the binding up with this, which is a 3mm Swix scraper tool for scraping wax off skis. So it's 3mm thick, and I can actually set that up by just putting it between the front of the binding and the back of the boot, and the adjustment screw is just on the back here. Now be careful when you're adjusting this, because it's the opposite of what you think. So it would be unscrewing it to wind it forward and screwing it in to wind it back. So yeah, just keep track of which way that you're going and how the binding's moving. So the final thing that you'd have to set up is setting up the height of these turrets on the Freeride spacer, and basically they come with a whole bunch of different shims that fit underneath the top part. So it's basically 2 Torx 10 screws that you take out, and then you put the different thickness of shims to get the top of this turret nice and flush with the bottom of the boot. So it takes a little bit of trial and error to get it right, and what you want to basically be able to do is have a piece of paper between the turret and your boot, and to be able to easily pull the piece of paper out from underneath the boot. If it's any tighter than that, then you're going to be getting potentially pre-release on the heel, because the springs on the cam are going to be already engaged. So make sure that you set up those shims properly, and also if you have a lot of wear on the back of your boot, you might also need to add shims as well at some point. Some people might be finding this quite tedious and they'll be zoning out, but there's not really much point in having the Freeride spacer on there if it's not touching the boot correctly, because basically it's either just floating or you're going to be getting pre-release from the heel. So just take, 10-20 minutes to set it up properly and you'll be all good. So hopefully you found that video useful or interesting, but yeah, there's quite a lot of tech and things that go into these bindings. So it's worth noting that, yeah, ATK are really on this mission to perfect ski bindings like this. And I think if you're the type of person who is like me, you do a little bit of everything within skiing. You're not just kind of, putting your skis on in a car park and going up 2,000 meters, or you're not just skiing in the resort, or you're not just downhill skiing. This binding really is going to cover all bases. And I think for a lot of people who are traveling out to the Alps from the UK, or traveling out to the Alps from the States or from other parts of Europe, this binding is really going to cover them for most of the skiing that they do. There's some big name skiers out there that are using this binding as well, Nikolai Schirmer, for example. And yeah, I just think that ATK, from chatting to them over the last year or two about these bindings and kind of getting everything set up, they're really, really just very detail orientated, and I think it's just really good. It's really fun for me to get kind of really deep into the techie stuff like this. I know it's a little bit overwhelming for some, so well done if you sat through this whole video. Kudos to you. Hopefully it's going to snow soon and we can go skiing. I'd love to go skiing. That'd be great. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you soon.